It's hard to believe that only in 1973 were women allowed onto the floor of the London Stock Exchange. Women had traded stocks for years in other forums, managing portfolios on behalf of wealthy investors or trading small shares in the coffee shops of London's Exchange Alley. But repeated votes to admit women to the floor of the stock exchange were defeated. In fact, permission for the entry of women brokers was begrudgingly granted thanks to the creation of a united stock exchange in 1972, an amalgamation that included regional exchanges where women already enjoyed equal access. I'm delighted to be joined by some of those women brokers who were admitted to the LSE shortly after the ban was lifted 50 years ago, Michelle Underwood and Sarah Daines, as well as by Dr. James Taylor from the University of Lancaster, who is writing a history of the stock exchange. Sarah, were you agitating to be admitted to the floor of the stock exchange? Was it something that mattered to you?
It was part of my career development. I left school and did a business studies course because at that time most women were expected to be secretaries. I didn't want to be a secretary, so I didn't learn how to type. So I was lucky enough, having really enjoyed economics, to get a job in the city working for a small broking firm in their office as an assistant to an assistant. I was then offered, after about a year, the opportunity to go and be a blue button, which was the sort of apprenticeship level of the stock exchange, and you actually had to wear a blue button, and you were allowed to go around and ask prices from the various jobbers. And so if you had, like BP, there would be 3 or 4 different jobbers making different prices in BP, and you'd report the sort of average price back. After that, I was promoted to a dealer after a year or so, and the dealer, I had to take an exam, had to go in front of the Stock Exchange Committee to be given the authority to trade, and then I was allowed to deal. And then after that, a few years later, I was asked to be a member, and I became head of dealing at the broking firm that I was at. So for me, I was young. I was 25 in '86 when Big Bang happened. But for me, it was just a career progression, and I really enjoyed absolutely every day of it. It was a very interesting job to do.
So when you were a blue button, that was the first time that you went onto the floor of the stock exchange, and I assume that nearly everyone there was a man, and I assume these brokers you were going up and talking about prices were on the whole men. How well were they behaving towards you?
There were about 1,400 men on the stock exchange, or people on the stock exchange, let's put it that way. Probably maybe 10 women at any one time, but that's all I'd known. I'd only ever worked in a male environment. So I think after a while they didn't take much notice of us, but they were always terribly polite, charming. You needed a sense of humour to get through the day, but it was a long day, and we just carried on and we just did our thing there.
Michelle, I believe you were also a blue button.
Yes, I was.
What was your year of entry to the stock exchange?
I joined in 1980.
Did you still feel like a pioneer being a woman at that stage?
Well, I'd like to sort of reiterate what Sarah said. I don't think we saw ourselves as pioneers at that stage. I took a job at the government stockbrokers at the time. That was in 1978, in the research department. And it was whilst I was there that I was talking to a friend. He said, you know, have you thought about the stock exchange? And I said, oh, my God, they don't have women down there. And they said, oh, yes, they are. No. So I was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to be a blue button with Charles Stanley. And as Sarah said, you know, it is an apprentice level. You're learning, it's overwhelming. It's a very steep learning curve. You know, you have to remember so much.
Are we talking about a scene where men, as they nearly all were, are standing around in groups yelling at each other and doing the hand gestures? Is this...
No, very gentlemanly.
What did it look like?
Hexagon shape. Each corner had different stocks, different sectors, and you had your specialists there, which were called jobbers.
We're already talking about computer screens in these days.
No, we're not. No, this is... When Sarah and I joined, Sarah was there before me, there was no computers. You basically had the layout of the stock exchange floor, which were hexagons, all different sectors. Around that were telephones where we could communicate with the office. And then behind that were little rooms called boxes where everybody, all dealers congregated, picked up, spoke to the office. So that was the layout when we were there. Computers came in after Big Bang. Mm-hmm. So the market that we worked in was very gentlemanly. You had your experts who made their prices in whatever stock you were asking for. and we relayed that to the office.
And then, is that what you became? You became one of these experts over time, did you?
No, Sarah and I were on the broking side, and the people that were the specialists were actually called jobbers in those days. And one of our friends, Janet McCall, actually became one of the first jobbers with Wed Durlacher. So you had your two sides of the coin. You had the person making the price, so in racing terms, your bookmaker, and you had your punter. So Sarah and I were getting the prices for the person who wished to invest into those shares.
And then how did you progress? What did you go on to be in finance?
Well, it started off, you took your stock exchange practice exam, you then went up in front of the board, as Sarah mentioned, to become an authorised clerk, which is where you then wore a yellow badge. I didn't progress as far as Sarah in those terms because of Big Bang. So when Big Bang happened, I looked at the situation and thought, I think I need to expand my knowledge. So I joined Montague Investment Management and started to learn all about the European shares. And from there, I used to do the UK Arista trading. From there, I left. I was there about 8 years. I then went to Morgan Stanley. At Morgan Stanley, quite interestingly, an all-women's desk, which was quite novel for me, having always worked with men. And I was there 12 years, and I ended up running the desk for London. But the most amazing part about that segment of my career was the way technology actually made such an impact. I mean, I joined Morgan Stanley in, I think it was 95, and we had paper tickets. When I left, we had implemented, with the help of technology, straight-through processing, so you could hand your books.
Extraordinary changes. To explain, I mean, I can't really explain, although I was part of government at the time, but Big Bang was an enormous deregulation which broke down the barriers and the boundaries between stockbroking and what used to be called merchant banking. So we then had these financial giants, which enabled London to become super competitive, but also, I would suggest, opened us up to the potential of some of the catastrophes that we've suffered since. James, you've been offered here 3 moments in history: the arrival of women, Big Bang, that moment of deregulation, and the extraordinary changes in technology. Which of these has been most significant?
A great question, Michael. I think almost I'll answer that by outmanoeuvring you and actually thinking that we have to look at the longer history here, that quite rightly today the focus is on 1973, with wonderful pioneers such as Sarah and Michelle. But there are actually significant rumblings of change on the stock exchange generations before this. And a lot of my research has been looking at a much longer history of women's participation in finance. So as early as the late Victorian period, we have examples of women, enterprising, entrepreneurial-minded women, setting up their own brokerages and operating outside of the context of the stock exchange. When the stock exchange was formed back in the early 19th century, the whole aim of it, of formalising the market, was to exclude undesirables, as they put it. And one of those undesirable groups were women, frankly. But in the late 19th century, women decided to just take things into their own hands, set up their own brokerages. And several examples of women who are unknown today, women like Amy Bell, Beatrice Gordon-Holmes, set up very successful businesses which were quietly transforming the city. They were advertising the fact that women could thrive in finance, women could succeed in finance. The first documented case of a woman trying to gain admission to the stock exchange was not in the 60s, 70s, as we might think. It's as early as 1936 that women were confident enough to approach the stock exchange to write a letter saying, I want admission. And
It doesn't sound as though Michelle and Sarah were particularly agitators, but was there agitation? Was there a campaign?
I think some women were happy to just kind of work in their own way, work quietly, didn't see themselves as campaigners. Others very much were. The woman I referred to earlier, Amy Bell, was closely associated with the suffrage campaigns of that era. Beatrice Gordon-Holmes, she actually wrote an autobiography in the 1940s of her life. She was very proudly a feminist and was involved in a lot of new organisations in the interwar period for professional women, trying to transform the professional context for women. And then in the post-war world, Muriel Bailey, who married and became Muriel Wood, was perhaps the most prominent campaigner for women's rights. And it was kind of what secured change, I think, in the 70s was partly a combination of the campaigns of women like Muriel Bailey, but also circumstances that were beyond the stock exchange's control. So one factor is the fact that women were gaining entry to the regional stock exchanges, as you mentioned at the top. And when you have the merger of the nation's stock exchanges in 1972, that's when the vote goes through. An unintended consequence is that women now have rights of entry, because women were members of stock exchanges in Aberdeen, in Sheffield, in Manchester, and so on, and you couldn't really justify a two-tier system at that point. So that was significant. The legal context was also changing as well. The stock exchange had always been confident that it was on firm legal ground, excluding women, that this is a private club, this is a men's club, and it's up to us who we include and exclude as members. That changed, that kind of legal defence was blown apart in the mid-60s when a woman racehorse trainer successfully sued the Jockey Club, basically. She wanted a training licence. She took the
let me bring, if I may, let me bring Sarah back in. You did not talk about facing hostility. As you look back, though, are you not absolutely quite shocked now to think that women weren't allowed onto the stock exchange floor until 50 years ago?
Yes, I mean, that's interesting, but they were women that had fought a lot for themselves. They were very professional women, and it was just something that was evolving, I think, wasn't it? 50 years ago, things were very, very different. Education has changed tremendously. Yeah. And when I did my business studies course, I think there was one other woman on the course there. There wasn't the opportunities. And coming through, when we were there in the late 70s, we had a female prime minister who was empowering women and making us all feel that, yes...
I remember her. Yeah, I remember her. Yeah. Michelle, bring us up to date. I have read that actually the number of women in finance in London has fallen sharply in recent years, apparently down by about 30%. What's going on? Have you any idea about that?
I have thoughts, but I don't know it definitely.
What's your thought?
I think Big Bang has changed things slightly because the working from home, etc. It depends. I think in investment banking, hours are long. Women make decisions. Not only are they sometimes a bread earner, they also have to look after a household as well. And sometimes maybe they just decide that it's too much. I think the other reason that there aren't more women, potential reasons, is men are very good at promoting themselves. And I don't think women are as well. So, you know, a woman will apply for a job, and I'm saying this because this is what I used to do. If I could do 100% or a bit more of that job, yeah, I can do that job. So then I'd apply. And I have, in my history, experienced men applying for jobs that I eventually got. And I'm thinking, why are you applying? You couldn't even do 50% of what was on that. Anyway,
I want to confirm that completely. Any man who thinks he can
I
do
just say one
nearly
thing?
50% of the job definitely applies.
Right, just one thing. Sorry to interrupt. I think what women are missing were role models and are still role models. And the most important thing is you need a sponsor, whoever you are, whether you're male or female. You need somebody who's going to put their head on the line and say, this person can do this job. This person is the best person. And I don't think there are enough people doing that for women.
Well, a lot of very interesting history and very interesting reflections as well.